Who's getting ready to do the whole trail? Who's thinking about it? Everybody in this room is smarter than me. We're kind of near the start time, and I always like to get to know people before the official kickoff begins, and so I like to chit-chat a little bit before we get started. One of the things I like to do is I like to get to know you guys before you get to know me, because I've been giving this talk for a pretty long time now. I think almost 3 years I've been giving some version of this talk. And I found out over the years that I've got... okay, so if I tell the entire story of my hike from start to finish, the shortest version that I have of that is 11 and a half hours. Who wants to watch the sunrise with me tonight or tomorrow morning? So what happens is there's like a million different versions of this talk, and it never works if I stand up here and just tell you things, because we would really need like a week or a month together to cover it all. So I find that this works best if I kind of let you guys direct, and I'm not it's not going to be pure Q&A. I have a lot of things that I do want to share with you, but if at any point I start telling a story or teaching or lecturing on a certain topic, I try not to lecture, and you get an idea or you think of something that you want to know more about, and it looks like I might not go down that path, let's go down that path together. So raise your hand, or even don't, just yell at me. I think this works better as a conversation. It's like a two-way thing. So we're not at school and we're not at work. We're just kind of hanging out together and having fun. I think that Janae may have mentioned in the email that went out that we are recording tonight's program. Is everybody okay with that? If anyone's on the witness protection program, I'll blur your voices out if we need to. One of the things that I'll explain a little bit in more detail when we get to the end is that in addition to doing this, I also host a podcast. And we're not going out on the air live right now or anything, but I'll take the recording from this class and maybe a few others and string them together into an episode, which will come out pretty soon. I'll show you guys how to find out about that, or how to locate that when we get to the end. So let's, quick show of hands. I asked already how many people are planning on doing a full through hike, and nobody's hand went up. How about long section hikes or weekends, or what are you guys interested in? How do you want to experience the trail? What are you looking forward to out there?
This year we have 2 trips planned. We're going to do a 3-day hike in North Carolina, and then in September we're going to do the Massachusetts portion.
Okay, awesome. Anybody planning to do like 100 miles or more, or 200 miles, or 3, 4, 5, anything like that? Long, we call them lashers, long-ass section hikers. Cool. All right. So has anybody already done the whole thing? I didn't ask that version of the question. So
35 years ago.
35 years ago. Very different experience. I'm sure. I want to talk to you some more later. So let's talk a little bit about my relationship with the trail. My name's Gary Sizer, and the first time I ever slept in a tent was in Marine Corps boot camp at Parris Island in 1991. That was a really long time ago. Prior to that, I loved the outdoors, but didn't know it, and it manifested by me sleeping on the porch as often as I could. That was the best I could do. Something about having the wind on my face at night is just absolutely magical. I still, to this day, love that. But Parris Island was the first time I ever slept in a tent. A couple of years into my Marine Corps career, early 90s, someone told me about this trail that went 2,000 miles from Georgia to Maine. And I was already using my leave and every available vacation time that I had to go on more backpacking trips. I loved the sleeping in the tent part, the yelling and the push-ups, not so much. But as soon as I heard that this long, possibly half a year long hiking experience existed, without even bothering to see whether anyone had even done it yet, I said, I have to do this. It just is a thing that I must do. I was instantly compelled. I don't know why, I still don't. I just want to live outside. But the Marines are not very generous with their time. They're not going to give you 6 months off to go pursue your dream when you're supposed to be, disciplined and standing still for a really long time. They have other ideas for how you're going to spend the next 4 years, let alone 6 months. So it always stayed on the back burner. And then I went to college, and then I got a job, and then I got a house, and all these other things kept happening. But the trail was always there in the back of my mind. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I started to realize that this dream that I had was always going to be a dream, until I found some way to convert it into a plan and then into a reality. Otherwise, it was always going to be this thing that, oh, someday. It turns out someday never gets here. The conditions are probably never right for you to do this. I was 44 years old. I was about 10 years into a pretty successful career as a software consultant. The company that I worked for got bought by a much larger company and just sucked the soul out of everything we did. And I was having a bad day at work. I was actually having a bad month at work. And I was sitting in my front yard porch staring at the mountains at the Blue Ridge Parkway. I could see Mount Pisgah, and I was just picturing myself walking among the trees. And I was supposed to be working on some kind of a spreadsheet or something, but it was a nice day, and I needed to be outside. And it kind of clicked with me that if I don't finally do this, I'm just never going to do it. And I'd been saving and studying and kind of thinking, in a couple of years, I had gone from someday to in a couple of years, but that day I decided I just have to do it like this year. So I called my boss. And rather than asking for time off, I just decided that I would just find another job when I got back. I felt pretty confident in my resume and my skills that, I'll move on. I'll find something else. So I called my boss and I quit my job. And then I called my wife, who is with us here tonight. Quickly realized that I should have done those two things in the opposite order. But my wife, Katie, is very supportive, and she was behind me 90% of the way. And together, the two of us turned this thing into a plan, and we gave it a good solid attempt. A little bit more about how that turned out in a minute. But before we get on the trail, I'm going to talk a little bit about the trail itself. Because after I made that phone call, I had 3 weeks to get myself on trail. And I'd been thinking about it. I knew what it was. I'd read Bill Bryson, so I felt, like, oh yeah, I think I can do this. But I hadn't actually done the research. Like, I hadn't purchased an AWOL guide yet. And I had all the gear because I've been backpacking for years. That wasn't a concern. But what do I do about health insurance? How do I resupply? All these things that I've never thought of. That's how I spent my 3 weeks leading up to the day that I stepped off. What I didn't learn until I got back from the trail is that this thin strip of dirt has a magnificent history behind it. We're coming up on almost 100 years since the idea of the Appalachian Trail was first conceived by a fellow named Benton Mackay. He's got a trail named after him, the Benton Mackay Trail down in Georgia. In 1921 was the first time that he put pen to paper and said officially, hey, we should do this. Mackay I like to think of him as America's original hippie. He was a poet, he was a philosopher, and he had this dream to bring people together on a corridor up and down the East Coast. The shelters in his original draft were called communes, and the idea was for people to escape the hustle and bustle of modern day life. The 20s were pretty hectic. They were roaring, as a matter of fact, and come at the trail from the sides, visit it for a couple of days, recharge their batteries, and then go back to work. So that was his original and almost his whole vision for the trail. Turns out nearly 100 years later, of the 5 million people who visit the trail each year, something like 4.5 million of those people are only there for a day or two at most. So that really is what wound up happening with the trail once it was finally complete. Never had any idea that anyone would walk from one end to the other. It seemed absurd, like the 4-minute mile. Once somebody finally did it, people started doing it. This dream that Benton Mackay had actually remained a dream for a while because, as we know about hippies, they're good at dreaming and poetry, but not the best at planning and making schedules. And that's where Myron Avery comes into the picture. Myron Avery is often referred to as the architect of the trail because he's literally the architect of the trail. He was the guy that organized the crews with the pickaxes and filed the correct paperwork with the government to get the land that they needed, or and managed the thing. The two of them, instead of butting heads, you would think opposite personalities would fight the whole time. Great idea for a sitcom, right? Two guys try to build a trail. One of them's wacky, the other one's not. But instead, they formed this beautiful team that worked together for about 13 years, and they organized thousands of people all up and down the East Coast to get out there with shovels and even voluntarily donate some of their land to make this thing a reality. Myron Avery was the first section hiker. He walked the entire length of the trail over the 13 years that it took to build the thing. And those surveyor wheels on a stick, he pushed one of those the entire length of the trail to get the original estimated length. The length, by the way, as you may or may not know, changes almost yearly as they reroute the trail for different things. A couple of years ago, remember Hot Springs had all of the wildfires. They'll move the trail, or it'll gain a mile or lose a mile. So the official length changes from year to year. The trail goes through 14 states. 31 organizations voluntarily maintain this thing, and some interesting people have some notable firsts that I'd like to go over before we get into the nuts and bolts of this. The first person to hike the entire thing from end to end was a man by the name of Earl Schaffer. Earl Schaffer, in his words, did it to walk off the war. He had just come back from World War II and was suffering from what we then called shell shock, we now know as PTSD. And again, just like Mackay's original vision of the trail, to this day, people are still doing what Earl Schaffer did. We have groups like Hike for Mental Health and Warrior Hike. And the trail has become not just a place of recharging your batteries, but actual rehabilitation. For some people, it becomes an escape. The first woman to solo the AT, raise your hand if you know who Grandma Gatewood is. So a lot of hands in the room going up. Grandma Gatewood is a famous figure for being the first woman to solo the trail. She did this in was it the late 50s or early 60s? I always forget. Someone who's read the book. I think it was late 50s, but it was during a time when, unfortunately, it was societal norm that husbands beat their wives, and she was trapped in an abusive relationship. And one day, Grandma Gatewood just said, "I've had enough." She was about 60 to 63 years old, and said, I've had enough, and walked away from this, literally, and for a really long way. She did the trail, I think southbound, her first attempt. She did it 3 times. But we like to talk about all the ultra-light gear and, getting our base weight down to something that has a decimal point in it, and, all of our high-tech, space-age, lightweight gear. And Grandma Gatewood went into the home's bathroom and took the shower curtain off of the bathroom stall and laid it out on the floor, threw everything in there that she thought she was going to need and rolled it up hobo style, threw it over her shoulder, and almost as an afterthought, she grabbed the shower curtain rod, and that was her hiking stick. And she also famously did this in a single pair of Keds tennis shoes. So, when I start thinking about, like, do I want the Gore-Tex ones or the, think about how things were so different when, back then, and the way Grandma Gatewood did it was just astounding. She gets a lot of attention, but I also think it's worth noting that she wasn't the first woman to actually hike the entire length of the trail. A woman before her, a few years prior, in the mid-50s, Mildred Ryder, whose trail name was Peace Pilgrim, did the entire trail in one hiking season, while in charge of a troop of Boy Scouts, which I think is a little harder than soloing, probably, and maybe deserves a little higher on the list and maybe a little more recognition than she gets, but her feat is pretty amazing too. All of this, to this day, is overseen by an organization known as the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, the ATC. Their headquarters is in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. It's approximately halfway. They call it the psychological halfway point of the trail because it's close enough to the midpoint. It's a pretty significant landmark, and a lot of really neat things happen at that building. They've got a lot of artifacts and history related to the construction and maintaining of the trail and people who have done famous things on it. One of the things I really like about Harpers Ferry at the ATC headquarters is that they have all of these binders that are just full. They're laminated, gigantic 3-ring binders that are full of the Polaroid photos that every hiker who passes through takes at their front door. It's kind of an iconic image. You've probably seen it online quite a few times. But they keep those binders, and you can go back years and years and look up people who, by their trail name and where they're really from. And it's one way that hikers stay in touch. I always like to share this picture because it spoils the ending of the story. This is at the base of Mount Katahdin, the northern end of the trail. And I like to, one of the themes that I like to keep as we discuss the trail tonight is that the trail is full of surprises. No matter how much, whether you have 3 weeks to prepare or whether you've been doing real research your entire life, you're still going to be surprised on a daily basis out there. With no intention of doing this whatsoever, I just happened to arrive at the base of Mount Katahdin on my 45th birthday. Timing just worked out. And my hiking buddies and my wife had all been secretly coordinating behind my back. And Katie drove all the way up from North Carolina to Baxter State Park and reserved a shelter for us. And what did it take you, 4 days to get up there or something? 2 days? It took us 4 days to get back, though, but we had a lot of people visit. It took her a long time to get up there. And I had cake and banners, and it was just such an incredible experience. But the surprising nature of everything out on the trail is just, that's definitely going to be a theme tonight. This is something you've probably heard a million times. A lot of people talk about the trail and they get sidetracked because they want to talk more about the people. They want to talk about their buddies or the people who they met out there on the trail. And I think that if you're going to visit the AT, whether it be for a single day, just an afternoon, whether you're going out for a week or you're trying to do the whole darn thing in one go, there's a pretty high probability that you're going to run into somebody who you're going to enjoy sharing some time with and having a conversation with. You don't run into too many slackers at 6,000 feet, but you also don't run into too many normal people either. Like, there's something a little weird about wanting to, go out into, we've got running water back home, right? We could, but some people enjoy pooping in the woods a little more. About the people, just to kind of give one example of this, we'll probably sidetrack about people an awful lot tonight. But when I started the trail, I was a 44-year-old software consultant, and my two best friends wound up being a young lady who had just graduated college a few weeks ago, I think, with a degree in neuroscience and anthropology, and a former Israeli army medic whose dream in life was to be a cartoonist. Where else am I ever going to meet people like this and really bond with them? And they turned out to be best friends, almost like family. More about them later. Okay. So this is a picture of me on the day that I started my hike. Two things that I want to point out. One is the start date. May the 10th is about the latest you would want to start a northbound hike, unless you're in really, really, really good shape. I found this out the hard way. So here's the way my brain works. Here's what I thought. It's May 10th, and I'm thinking I've got most of May, June, July, August, September. First week of October, they start closing down Baxter State Park because the snow is up to your chest, and it's too dangerous to let people attempt the final mountain. So kind of got a ticking clock, a little bit of a race against time, but 5 months and some change. People have done it in quicker times than that, so I made up a schedule and thought, okay, I'm going to make my run at this. My backup plan was, if it looked like it was going to take me too long and they're potentially closing the mountain and, what do I do now? Ahead of that, like say maybe mid-August, late July or whatever, whenever I got to the point where I thought, oh, dang, I'm not going to make it, I'll just jump all the way up to the end, like fly or catch, hitchhike, whatever, and then just start hiking back to the point where I got off. That's actually a very common way to do the trail. It's called a flip-flop hike, and there are an infinite number of combinations of starting and end points that you can pick. Harper's Ferry is a very popular one. Some people will do the top half of the trail and then come back to Harper's Ferry and then do the bottom half of the trail, either direction. So that was, it was kind of my backup plan. But that was the first thing I wanted to point out, was the start date. The second thing is, I just kind of want to. So the projector's really stretching out the image. It's making my face look a lot rounder than it really is. But in reality, I was well fed. I was very optimistic about my chances, and I was super fired up because this is the face of a man who is about to tackle his lifelong dream. This is the face of someone who is just done with his lifelong dream. Like, okay, I've had enough. 147 days in. So I was about a week from the end here. I had Giardia and didn't know it. I think I had just stubbed my toe for the 27th time. But some pretty stark things happen to the human body during an experience like this. And I kind of like to start by talking about some of the physical changes and the way that All right, so we don't need to look at that for too long. But there was an interesting question on the bottom there. Where did the pecs come from? All right, so when I started the trail, I needed to lose about 20 pounds. What wound up happening was I lost 47 pounds. And the last 15 of them came off in Maine. So hikers have a saying that if you're going to be a northbound hiker, the first 80% of the trail will take 20% of the effort. That remaining 20% will require the remaining 80% of effort. And it's kind of true because, if you hike around here, we've got some pretty tall mountains here. We've got some pretty big peaks, some pretty, respectable prominences, 2,000 foot, 3,000 foot climb in a single day. But, most of our mountains, it'll take you all day to get that 4,000 foot elevation change. Up in New Hampshire, the terrain changes to the point where you're going to get 4,000 feet of elevation change over the first mile, 2,000 up and then 2,000 down. Whereas we kind of have these nice eroded, curvy mountains down here. Up north, all the mountains look like the drawings in a kid's coloring book, very pointy. In fact, up north, one of the things that the trail maintaining clubs do, I think starting in Vermont and New Hampshire, you'll see, you'll come up to a spot on the trail and the next white blaze is up something like this. So rather than having hikers be required to carry ropes and climbing equipment with them, the trail clubs will do one of two things. They'll either pound rebar into the rocks, or some of them will just hike in a 14-foot aluminum ladder, lean it up against the cliff, and it just stays there. And that's just part of the trail now. To kind of give you an idea of how different the terrain is up there. It's not all like that, but you'll see at least 25 to 30%, I would say, of the trail is going to be something that you're going to look at and just start really questioning your life's choices at that point. This is an interesting image because it looks like I broke off the tip of my trekking pole, but what we're really looking at here is this is the pole one of the poles that I started the trail with, and in Vermont, about 1,800 miles into the trail, Katie mailed me a fresh set from home, and I just thought the difference was worth noting. Just, how many inches of titanium is just gone from just going click, click, click a few thousand times a day. It doesn't seem like much, but, it all adds up and just breaks it down. And, if you think about it, if that's happening to metal, what's happening to your feet? Or your knees, or your muscles, or your spirit. It feels like that some days. In fact, that feeling starts very early on. The human body has an advantage that trekking poles don't, and that's the ability to regrow tissue. And what's interesting and surprising is that after the first month or so on trail, the way your body processes nutrients changes radically. And if I always say I got to remind myself to bring something I can draw on. Imagine my finger is drawing a line in the air. Whatever your baseline level of fitness is at the start of your hike, if today, if you could walk from your car and come up the stairs and get into these seats without getting too winded, I think you've got a pretty good chance at this. I know a guy we'll talk more about that later. Sidetrack. Focus, Gary, focus. All right, so whatever your baseline level of fitness is right now, if you started the trail tomorrow, regardless of whether you're a marathon runner or you just got off the couch yesterday, you've got your starting point. And after about 2 or 3 days of, imagine it's leg day at the gym, but your workout is 12 hours long and you don't switch to arms at any point. With 30 pounds on your back, that's basically what, climbing mountains with a pack is. P90X CrossFit cannot simulate this. After about the second or third day, the muscles in your legs are fatigued to the point where your ability to climb those mountains is going to decline. And with that, so is your mood a little bit too. You're gonna get discouraged. It's gonna become more of a challenge. And after about 4 or 5 days of this, it really becomes a struggle because you're not giving your muscles time to rest and recuperate and regenerate the tissue that you're destroying with your 10-hour daily leg workouts. So what winds up happening is somewhere around day 4 or 5, you hit pretty much the lowest point that you're going to get during that starting phase. And I call it the valley of despair, because if you can get through it, your body's going to start reacting and behaving differently. Your muscles are going to process protein a bit more efficiently than they used to. Your lung capacity will actually increase as you grow new capillaries inside your lungs. Your blood flow will increase. All of these things will make you a stronger hiker, and after about a week to 10 days, you're back kind of where you started. But an interesting thing happens is that if you keep up this process, your ability keeps climbing. And you start to notice that you're hiking longer and longer days in the more miles in the same amount of time, and it doesn't hurt as much at the end of the day. And then one day, about a month into your hike, you're going to find yourself, you're standing at the shelter, and it's only 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and you're going to check the time, and you're going to do the math and go, I just walked 18 miles, and I feel great. And that means you have your trail legs. It sneaks up on you. We call it trail legs when you get to that point that a 20-mile day is now the new normal. You hear about thru hikers and you eavesdrop on their conversations, and you hear things like, I did 26 today, or I did 25, and you just think, oh man, these guys must, have been in the gym for years to train for this. And no, the trail will ease you into that lifestyle as far as the physical abilities go. Now, there are some downsides to this. You don't turn into some kind of superhuman athlete. Other things are happening as your legs and your lungs are growing and becoming stronger. The only upper body workout that you're getting is your trekking poles, and they weigh nothing. And occasionally grabbing a branch and or steadying yourself. Right? You're not doing anything at all. So all of your upper body strength kind of goes away, and that combined with one other factor, your leg muscles are now in like super hummingbird metabolic mode, right? Everything you eat is going to your legs. And if you're not consuming enough calories, if you're not consuming as much calories as you're burning, 6,000 per day, by the way, you'll burn 6,000 calories per day on the AT. If you're not consuming as much as you're burning, your body will start looking for other fuel to keep that metabolic process going. And the only available protein is the muscle tissue that you're not using. So your body will actually begin to metabolize existing muscle tissue. We say that your legs are eating your arms. And that's kind of what's happening. If you let that go on for too long, the byproduct of that new process is ammonia, and it will come out in your sweat, which means that your clothes will be ruined. Your pack will be ruined. You'll smell like cat pee. And I experienced this. By the time I got to Damascus, which is 500 miles into the trail, I was in like maximum protein deficiency mode. And my hiking buddies actually asked me, they said, did a cat pee on your gear at some point? Did something come into our camp? And it was really that bad. Katie, back home, Mission Control, gets on the internet and does the research and just tells me, oh, you need to eat more protein and complex carbohydrates. It was her idea for me to start adding more tuna or maybe a protein bar, etc., at various resupply stops. I replaced my pack, and within a couple of weeks, back to normal, mostly okay. So, that's what I like to talk about when people say, how can I train physically for a long hike like this? And these rules apply to other long trails too, the PCT or the CDT. Your body is still going to go over, some of the same things. The AT is more forgiving, and probably one of the reasons why it's so popular is because the southern end of the trail, in addition to being the perfect time of year to start spring, you're walking north as spring progresses north too. It's also because the terrain kind of eases you into this new lifestyle as well. It's not an event that you train for like a marathon. It's a new lifestyle that you gradually get into. On day 1, if you start at Springer Mountain and go north, the first shelter is, I don't know precisely, but it's about 8 miles. So in the middle of April or early May or even late March, you've got about 10 to 12 hours of daylight to tackle that 8 miles. Let's say 12 hours. So if you get a good early start, you can hike for a mile and then stop and rest for an hour. Walk for an hour, rest for an hour. Just keep up that nice casual pace until you get to that first shelter. roll out your sleeping bag, cook up some hot noodles, get a good night's sleep, and tomorrow basically do the same thing again. I think the second one might be 9 or 10 miles, but it's still, you don't need to start cranking out 20s on day 1. Day 3, middle of the day, you're gonna find yourself at a road where if you could stick out your thumb, you're 20 minutes away from a hot shower and a cheeseburger and laundry and a hotel. And that 3-day scenario that I just described is basically the AT experience. Just repeat that, 60, 70 times or 80 times or however long you want to take. It's interesting because in a way, if you say it like that, it makes it sound like the trail is kind of a monotonous experience. You just wake up and walk every day. But I think that's also, the flip side is also true, or I think that's not true because every day on the trail is something completely different. It's like a Monty Python episode, and now for something completely different. The way I like to describe it is if you take anybody's average, just any average person, and take a random 6-month sample from their life, what you're probably going to get is some variation of the same day over and over again with a few little interesting things that stand out, right? You basically, whether you work in an office or, retail, whatever your job is, you wake up, you do that thing that you do for your profession, and then you go home and then spend time with your family, maybe watch your shows. Every 7 days you go for a hike on the weekend. Hey, remember that time we got a flat tire? Remember, like little things stand out. But on the AT, you don't even wake up in the same place every single day. So even though you're doing the same things, you're seeing new things and meeting new people and having new challenges. And if you just happen to pick that 6-month period, you've got 180 unique days. And within each day, you probably have about 200 or 300 unique experiences. And it's just so many interesting things happen in such a short period of time that for a lot of people, it feels like the most important thing they've ever done or the most memorable time of their life. Or, I spent 10 years in the military, and the AT, that 5 months that I did, I still remember more about that than I did an entire decade of my life, just because it's so unique and interesting every single day. Among those unique challenges that you face every day, which are physical challenges, something that you can't really train for by altering your nutrition or doing certain exercises, is embrace the suck. Have you ever heard that expression before? Military people like to say that one, embrace the suck. What that means on the AT is basically this. You have, by deciding to take on a 6-month hike, regardless of what long trail it is, you are guaranteed a 100% chance that at some point it's going to rain for 4 or 5 days consecutively, like nonstop. So you will be waking up and putting dry feet into cold, wet socks, and then a cold, wet shoe, and then you're going to do it with the other foot, and you better smile because you're the one who decided to do this. That's what embrace the suck means, right? You can't really practice that. Or, well, you kind of can. You kind of can. One way that you can practice that is, this might sound a little bit crazy, but, remember what we're talking about doing here. Look at the weather and start watching for, a cold front to come through, or start watching for like a really shitty weekend when it's going to rain for like 3 days somewhere, and then plan your backpacking trip for that weekend. Because it's going to be better for you to find out that you hate being wet 24 hours while you're at least within driving distance of your house, than 3 weeks into your through hike and you've already, quit your job or whatever. You know what I mean? Like these are conditions that you can simulate at home. And if you don't want to do something extreme, like, spend a whole weekend in a thunderstorm, if you have a lawn sprinkler, or if you have a neighbor or friend that does, take your lawn sprinkler and lock it in position so that it just soaks one patch of the yard. And then, I'm not kidding, I used to do this. And then, set a timer on your phone or a stopwatch or something and see how long it takes for you to get your tent on that wet patch of mud and you in it in a sleeping bag without ruining your sleeping clothes or your sleeping bag. Turns out 5 minutes is actually a pretty average time once you've done your drills. Your neighbors are going to look at you funny, but in a few weeks you'll be so far up the trail it doesn't matter. Okay. So that's kind of the end of my practical, like, how-to stuff, aside from like gear, logistics, water filtration, do I want a tent or a hammock? And this is the part that I was kind of warning you guys about earlier that could take days to cover if I just told you everything that I have an opinion on regarding, the how-to part. So what I kind of like to do from here forward is I've got some pictures that are going to follow on the screen that have some nice stories that we can share. But this is also kind of like where I like to ask you guys what you're interested in. What aspect of trail life would you like to know more about? The resupply, the food, what kind of things are you wondering about? Yes, sir.
About what percentage of people start up north towards south?
Good question. So the question was, what percentage of people start up north versus starting in the south? So it's probably 3 to 1, maybe even 4 to 1, starting at the bottom and working their way north. There's probably 5 times as many northbound attempts as there are southbound attempts, and I'll share with you why. As we've kind of already described, the southern end of the trail eases you into this lifestyle a bit more gently. Up north, remember, we've got all those rebar and ladders and hand-over-hand rock scrambles. So if you're going to start up north, you should probably already be a very strong hiker and in very top physical condition. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but it helps to have maybe about a month's worth of trail life under your belt before you go to Katahdin and start heading south. Not just because Katahdin itself is so challenging, but if you're heading south, what's immediately south of Katahdin is something called the 100-mile wilderness. And it's the longest point on the entire trail between resupply points. It's actually 102 miles. And what they don't tell you is that the resupply points on either end of the 100-mile wilderness are also kind of questionable. So it's more like 120 miles, and you're not going to see a cheeseburger, for a really long time. So if you're going to start north and head south, you pretty much need to have your gear dialed in. Trail legs would really help. That 100-mile stretch, even if you're capable of knocking out a 20-mile day, that's still 5 days. That's a lot of weight to carry, and the terrain is very challenging. So people who head south want to hear more about how hard it is. The mountain doesn't open until either late May would even be early, like June. Late June or July, people are starting their southbound hikes. Who's been to Maine in June or July? Not many hands have gone up because those people were carried away by black flies. They have swarms of, like, billions of black flies that will coat. I wish I had a picture of us in Newfoundland. The black flies will just coat you. Like, we wear these mesh headgear to keep them off, and it's just, you just have to sweep them off of your face because there's so many of them, and they bite, and it's just so miserable. And everything just thawed, so the mud is fresh and deep, and the rocks are all slippery, and the moss will throw you down very quickly. Some of the most beautiful, beautiful terrain you'll ever see in your life, though. Maine is, hands down, my favorite part of the trail in terms of beauty and a wild, natural experience. So, so starting south, the upside to going south, if you start up north and head south, some of the advantages are you're going to get more solitude. The northbound hiking experience is very social. Especially if you start when everyone starts, which is the middle of March. When was your start date? April 1st? So I think 35 years ago, April 1st, would you say that was about an average? There weren't really enough hikers to have an average start date, right? How long was it before you felt crowded? Never? Not that crowded. So the thing about start dates, April 1st, if you're going to go north, is a perfect time to start because you're going to be walking north at about the same rate spring does. If you stand still in one place and watch the flowers bloom, one particular type of flower, let's say rhododendrons, you're going to get about a week of the flower blooming and then the flowers go away. If you're walking north and you happen to catch that wave, you'll be with the rhododendrons as they're blooming for a good 6 weeks, because you're just following the warm temperatures as they move north, about the same pace as a hiker. That's one of the reasons why that's so popular. But back in the day, April or even that early May start date wasn't really that big of a deal. There weren't too many people on the trail. But I would say probably in the mid-'80s, the trail started becoming very popular. And everybody got the idea that, well, it's starting to get a little bit crowded, so I'm going to start before the crowds start. And each year, people's start dates would keep moving back a little bit sooner and a little bit sooner. But the problem is everybody had the same idea. So each year, they call it the bubble. It gets a little bit bigger and it starts a little bit earlier. What did Miss Janet say? February 1st, 57 hikers started. So if 57 people start on a single day, when you get to that first shelter, what do you think that's going to be like? It's going to be pretty crazy. So the ATC actually faces a lot of challenges right now in terms of trying to get people to consider alternate routes, like the flip-flop that we mentioned earlier, or the southbound hike. It's not so bad. There are other ways that we can help minimize our impact on the trail, and one of them is actually starting later. Let the bubble go through, and then you start your hike in April after everybody's already gone through. Pros and cons to pretty much every choice you might make in that regard. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Would you settle on an ideal pack weight? I know it varies depending on whether you have 120 miles
right
that you have to cover, but in general, did you settle on an ideal pack weight?
So the question was about ideal pack weight. And for me, I've always been one of those hikers that I actually never put my pack on a scale until I got about halfway through Virginia. And it was just because I happened to be at a hostel that had a scale, and I thought, I wonder what this thing weighs. Turns out it was 22 pounds that day. I've since weighed my pack in other various configurations, and I've weighed it, since then. And here's what I learned. What I used to do was I would load up my pack with everything that I needed. I would put it on my back, and I'd go like this, and I'd say, I think I can carry that. Or if it was too heavy, I'd take something out. I never looked at the numbers or anything like that. Kind of the way I've led my life, really. My wife, on the other hand, who is a bookkeeper and an ultralight hiker, has a spreadsheet that calculates how much each dollar spent affects the number of grams she has to carry. Your base weight has a decimal point in it, doesn't it? Very different approach to hiking, but both are whatever works for you. Whatever works for you is best. Some people want an ultralight pack because they're trying to set a record, or some people have an ultralight pack because they've got a bad hip. And, they want to be able to hike 10 miles without it hurting. Some people just do it for fun. I eventually started really caring about my pack weight because I noticed the phrase you hear all the time is every ounce counts. Hikers like to rhyme things a lot. Every ounce counts. You ever hear about people who snap their toothbrush in half because they want to save weight? I learned that if you snap your toothbrush in half lengthwise, it still saves weight, but now your friend has a toothbrush too. Just little things like that. Just pop in. Weird things happen out there. So the lightest my pack ever was 16 pounds, and that was in Northern Virginia during July when it was about 70 degrees at night. I sent home my sleeping bag, and I used my raincoat as a blanket and my laundry as a pillow. I spent probably about 200 miles pretending to be ultralight. Getting rid of everything I possibly could, and it was nice. It was really nice, especially on that flat Virginia terrain. You get up on those long ridges, and you just walk all day, and you go down for water, and then you go back up, and you just walk all day. That's when I was cranking out my 20s, my 25-mile days with no problem at all. The heaviest my pack ever was, since I started weighing it, was in New Hampshire, because I had all my cold weather gear with me. We were getting snow in New Hampshire in late September. So occasionally some ice on the trail, high wind conditions. So I had snow pants, I had a down jacket, I had a heavier sleeping bag, 36 pounds fully loaded with food and water. So depending on where you are on the trail, what time of year it is, your pack weight can double depending on how enthusiastic you are about your own comfort, which I am. Okay, so we're talking about pack weight and ways to save weight, and I had an idea for something, but I forgot what it was. So,
what would you do now if you did it for bears?
Oh.
You probably hung your bag, but now they do the bear canister.
That's right. Yeah, so bears and food, that's a big thing on the AT. Quick show of hands, who's run into a bear on a hike or in the woods? Okay, so I'd say about 10 hands went up. Okay, flip side, who's never had an encounter with a bear in the woods? Okay. What about just like in your yard? Because this is Asheville, right? Okay, so pretty much everyone's had some kind of bear experience. The thing about the trail is, and you guys probably already know this, but I always like to go over it, is that the bears were there first, right? We're going into their house. You know, when somebody says a bear came into the shelter, well, we kind of built a shelter where the bears live, right? It's really on us to make sure that our presence in the woods doesn't harm the bear population. Because presumably we are smarter than them, but I don't know, I've seen evidence to the contrary. So one of the ways that we respect bears is by being careful with our food storage at night. Bears have incredibly powerful senses of smell. They can smell the soup in an unopened soup can, like a can of soup from miles away. It's amazing how many olfactory receptors they have in their nose. It's ridiculous. But they'll come for long distances for just the tiniest sniff of anything. So what we do is, rather than conditioning the bears to know that your tent equals potential food supply, we do something with our food at night that gets it away from where we sleep. One of the most popular solutions is the bear hang, right? All you need is a rope. You can find a rock or something heavy at just about any campsite, tie it to the rope. You get 3 tries, and then your friend gets to take over. Just get it over a branch. What you're looking for is a branch that is at least 12 feet up and hopefully long enough that you can get the string or your cord about 10 feet away from the trunk of the tree, because bears are excellent climbers. All right, so you throw your rope over the tree, and then thunk, the rock lands on the other side. You know, if you're smart, you've got enough rope on both sides that you don't. You know, what happens to me a lot is, like, I'll throw my rope, and like I got a really good throw, and the rock will go, and I'll just see the tail of the rope over the branch too, like the tail of a comet. So sometimes I step on that other end. But once you've got that loop over your tree, just take a carabiner or something and learn how to make some basic knots. Tie a slip knot or something. Clip your food bag up, and then pulley that bag up so that it's, you want it to also be a good distance below the branch that it's hanging from, because if a bear does get out there, can he reach your bag? Right? So you're kind of looking for some really ideal conditions to do this, and that's not always easy to do. Some of your campsites will be above tree line. Some of your campsites will be in dense conifers where you don't even have 6 feet to put your tent, let alone a 10-foot branch anywhere. So it becomes very challenging. The ATC, I'm going to choose my words very carefully on this. The ATC has begun hinting that they might start considering someday requiring bear canisters on the southern portion of the trail. So that's kind of where we are now with the whole bear canister thing on the AT. There are 2 places? I know there's at least one. Watauga Dam is about a 5-mile section of trail where bear canisters are required year-round, regardless of whether you're a thru hiker or not. The way most people deal with that is, it's only 5 miles, don't stay there, hike through. That's generally how that's the hiker mentality for years. It's just, we just won't stay at Watauga. What happens though is something they call site creep. Site creep. If you block off an area and say no one is allowed to camp within these 5 miles, what winds up happening is people begin camping right at the edge of that So where do you think the bears will go now? To this new. So then the limit becomes within 10 miles, and so on. And after a decade of this, they just say, canisters, we're just doing canisters. So what they do now, if you're in a place that doesn't have trees or a good place for a bear hang, is a lot of the shelters come equipped with anti-bear food systems. I just made that term up. Different ways that the shelters handle this bear problem is food cables. That's a popular one. If you've been to the Smokies, you've probably seen this. They have either the trees or between two giant wooden poles, a metal cable that's strung from one to the other, steel, and then some pulleys every few feet. It's already built in. The clips are even there. It's maintained by the trail clubs or the park. Some places will have bear vaults. They kind of look like those giant electrical boxes or like miniature dumpsters. And there's usually some kind of opening mechanism that requires opposable thumbs. The bears generally can't get in there. That's a popular solution. Another one that I saw only just in New Jersey. I never saw this anywhere else. New Jersey has the highest population of bears per mile of trail, by the way. New Jersey had bear poles, which were these metal, it's a metal pole, and at the top it almost branches out like a flower. There will be 4 to 6 other metal poles sticking out from the top like this with little hooks on the end. And the theory is they're about 12 feet tall, 12 to 15 feet, and each one comes with a stick that is also made out of heavy steel. And remember, your legs have been eating your arms for 3 months, so you have no upper body strength left. And you're supposed to use this heavy metal pole to hook your food bag and then somehow transfer it to the hooks up top with, and you haven't lifted anything heavier than a trekking pole in a month. And they chain the 2 poles together because apparently in New Jersey people will steal anything. But I think those are about the only solutions that I can remember seeing on the trail for people keeping the bears out of their food. Yes, sir.
Did you have any close encounters?
Did I have close encounters with a bear? I sure did. I actually had my closest encounter with a bear. Well, I had 2. I had one 3 days before I started my hike, on my shakedown hike. Went up to Shining Rock Wilderness. I camped out in Flower Gap, or close enough to Flower Gap, so I think some of you guys know where that is. And I walked about a quarter of a mile away from where my tent was set up to make dinner, and I cooked, and then I walked about another 100 yards away from where I was cooking to eat and enjoy the sunset when I saw this black shadow just moving across the field. And I thought, oh, is that a rock? Is that rock moving? And then I thought, no, that's a bear, and he's headed right towards my pack where all of my food is. So the cool thing about black bears, at least most of them, is that you can make them go away by clapping. You just clap your hands and they'll go away. The other way to frighten off a black bear is if they see you reaching for your camera. That always makes them run away too. I don't have any, and all I have are pictures of bear, well, not bear butts, but yeah, bear butts running away. My child. My wife had an interesting encounter with that same bear in Flower Gap about a year or 2 before my through hike. That bear actually stepped on her in the middle of the night. It came through our camp, and I guess her tent in the soft glow of the moonlight resembled a rock or something, and it was just trying to get to our food, which it got, didn't it? Yeah, we lost our food. That was the first time we ever lost our food to a bear. You'd think you would learn your lesson, or that I would learn my lesson, but that bear that charged towards my pack, I clapped my hands and I scared him away. But when I went back to my campsite and hung my food that night, it wasn't high enough, and I woke up the following morning with nothing. It's nothing. Turns out bears don't like sugar-free gum.
But they will bite it.
They will bite it to test it, but they'll eat everything. They'll eat everything. There were some people camped out next to us. About a group of about 12 college kids who were on spring break, and the bear got all of their food too. So think about 3 days worth of food for 12 people. One creature ate all of that. It's amazing. It's incredible. My second bear encounter was actually on the trail in New Jersey. they had a bear trap set out in front of one of the shelters. Not like one of those Wile E. Coyote traps, but think of like a giant have-a-heart trap, only huge. It's probably about 12 feet of steel, 8-foot diameter tube with a pressure plate on the inside and bagels as bait. And the pressure plate would drop a door. And while we were having breakfast that morning, we saw the bear actually walk in and activate the pressure plate. And there's a phone number on the side of the bear trap. So we called, and the rangers came out. It was the most exciting thing we'd seen in a while. And we were talking to him. We asked, "Wait, so what's going to happen to the bear?" It had already had a tag in its ear. And he said they set that trap specifically for that bear because it had figured out that the shelter, people were leaving food in the shelter, and the bear was actually going into the shelter, which is extremely rare for black bears. They don't like confined spaces, especially if other mammals are already in there, us. But the bear was just coming on in and like, "Hey, what's for dinner?" So they set the trap, and he said that they will probably relocate the bear. I said, "Oh, where does New Jersey relocate their bears?" And he said, "Probably Pisgah National Forest." So that bear may have been a New Jersey transplant, which explains why he was so darn aggressive. He was a Yankee bear. I don't know. I like to talk. Yes, we were already going to talk about bears anyway. Since here, let's do this one. Here's some fun wildlife that I saw that really surprised me. Have you guys ever seen one of these before? So this picture is actual size, and no, it's not. The red eft is probably only. I described them as a baby carrot with legs. They're only about this big, and you see them waddling around on the trail. Have you heard of something called blue car syndrome? Psychologists use this to describe a phenomenon where, if somebody tells you about something, you start seeing it everywhere. Like if you're shopping for a blue car, you suddenly notice that there are so many other blue cars on the highway. That's why they call it that. But I got red eft syndrome while I was on the trail. After I saw these guys and figured out the pattern, I was able to see them almost daily on my hike. They're incredibly common on the AT. They come out mostly in the mornings. You're most likely to see them before 10 a.m., especially if it rained overnight. You can see this little guy splashing around in the mud. The red eft is one of the younger stages of the eastern newt. And what this little guy does, he's on a journey too. He kind of walks around. What they're looking for is, you ever find yourself on the trail and your mind is kind of wandering, and you think, like, you know where you're going. It's a few miles up ahead, and you just think, what if I just turned left here? Or just like started, went over this ridge. You know what I mean? You get that idea in your head. That's what these guys are doing. They're trying to go off trail because they're looking for these hidden little springs and pools and ponds that people don't frequent. So they're just passing through, and they're looking for a place to transform into something else. Once they get to water, and by the way, they'll spend about the first 6 years of their life as little baby carrots. And then once they get to a suitable water source, they'll go in there and begin transforming. Their legs will shrink and eventually disappear. Their tail will get longer, and they'll change color. They'll turn a shade of olive drab, and they'll double in length, and then triple and quadruple. They'll be almost 8 inches long at their biggest. And they swim around, and they look not quite like a fish, almost like a giant tadpole. And then they'll lay their eggs, and out of the eggs come little baby efts, and they crawl and find other ponds, and take about 6 or 7 years to turn into a legless thing again. They have this interesting life cycle. And I always found them really interesting, not only because, you got to admit, they're kind of cute, right? I mean, they're also kind of gross, but they're kind of cute. That color in nature, this bright orange, is it's their defense mechanism. It's their way of telling potential predators, go ahead and eat me. I'll be the last thing you ever eat. They don't need to be fast. You see certain salamanders or lizards, they're gone. Like their defense mechanism is agility and speed. These guys, they don't care. They're poisonous, and any bird that's been on the planet long enough to reproduce knows, oh, don't eat the orange things. So they have kind of a happy relationship with their surroundings, but they're on this transformative journey, kind of like a hiker. They walk a long distance. They're not really the same thing they were when they started. A lot of people get cool trail names on the trail, or they have like their spirit animal. Like some guy will be named Hawk or Lone Wolf. My spirit animal was the red eft. You don't get to pick your spirit animal. My trail name, by the way, was Green Giant. I hiked in a green shirt, and I'm 6'3", tall guy, green shirt. I wish I had a more exciting story about my trail name, but that's it. Maybe tall guy, low carbon emissions. I don't know. All right, so this actually is an actual size photo, I think. This is a... Can anybody tell what kind of rattlesnake that is? Who knows their snakes?
It'd be a Massasauga.
Oh, I don't know what that is.
That's a form of it's a pit viper. I
Okay.
grew up in Missouri, we have those. So
Oh, okay.
that's what it looks like to me. But
That is an eastern timber rattler. Eastern timber rattler, very common on the AT during the summer. Not so much down here. We do have them. You've got to go to some higher elevations and look for exposed rock faces because they love sunning themselves. You will see copperheads. Not too many venomous snakes on the trail. I'd say 99.9% of the snakes that you see are going to be rat snakes, black racers, garters, harmless snakes that have their only interest in you is getting away from you. You'll always see them, disappearing into the grass. They are no threat whatsoever. Turns out the venomous snakes are also not a threat unless you try to pick them up. Anybody ever try to pick up a rattlesnake? Nobody? Okay, good. You guys will do great out there. I like to tell people you don't really need to be afraid of rattlesnakes. You just need to respect them. When they curl up like they are in this picture, see he's got his tail up and he's making that. Has anybody ever walked across this in nature? A snake going. Popular misconception is that means they're about to strike. The reality is they just don't want to be stepped on. They're just trying to get some sun. They're just trying to relax, and they don't have ears. Snakes don't have ears. Their skin is actually their primary sensory organ when it comes to sound vibrations. And your feet, even from a significant distance, cause enough vibrations to get that snake's tail up. So by the time you see him, he's known you've been coming for quite a while. So his tail is up, not because he's angry. He's just going, hey, I'm down here. So our job as hikers is to just go, oh, a snake. Maybe take a picture and then just walk on. Certainly no reason to, pick them up or try to harm them or hear stories about people, eating snakes on the trail. Or there's no reason to do that. There's no reason at all. Okay, so what else have we got here? All right. Oh, this is a fun one. So I always like to show this picture. This is Franconia Ridge. Has anyone ever been here before? You guys know where this is? This is at the southern end of a mountain range in New Hampshire called the Whites. The Whites come with quite a bit of reputation. If you just look in this picture, you can see we're already starting to get into pointy territory. This is where it begins. About 18, maybe 1,900 miles into the trail. You can almost see the end from there. From here. And what happens is, if you're going north, the southbound hikers have slowly been trickling south. You're about 3/4 of the way through the trail before you see your first southbounder, and they all have these horror stories about the Whites. Like, oh, the Whites kicked our butts. It's so difficult. Guys, no, listen. Okay, check it out. When you get to the Whites, whatever your mileage is, divide it by 3. Okay, just cut it by 1/3. I'm serious, 1/3. And we're all like, right on, we'll do it. And then they would hike away, and we'd go, noobs. They're just starting the trail, right? They've only been on trail for a couple of weeks. Of course their legs are going to hurt. What do they know? Yeah, okay, we know the Whites are challenging. I can see in the map it's going to be tall. But the common thing that all the hikers do, we've been knocking out 25 miles a day for months now. Maybe it'll cut our mileage in half. No big deal. So my first day in the Whites, 7 miles. My second day in the Whites, 2 miles. And my third day in the Whites, we were still at the place that we did the 2 miles to get to because a freak snowstorm came in and pinned us down, and we couldn't leave the shelter. And the guy that we sent for water came back without 2 of our water bottles, and his raincoat was ripped because he fell. So we were like, yeah, maybe the southbounders are onto something, And this is just where it starts. The Whites ease you into it, and it gets even more, kind of crazy and ridiculous. Franconia Ridge. So this line here, this is actually the trail. You're walking along this pointy ridge. And it's so beautiful up there. It's so beautiful. By the time you get to this point, you really haven't seen real mountains in a while. You know, Virginia, remember I described it as those long, flat ridges? Kind of gets a little boring after a while. And then you've got Pennsylvania. What do we know about Pennsylvania? Pennsylvania is the devil's driveway. It's just rocks for 300 miles, every size and shape of rocks that you could possibly imagine. Small ones, big ones. You don't see dirt for 300 miles. I started developing a system in my mind, remember as a computer guy, so I was classifying different kinds of rocks and coming up with different names for them. And there were, my least favorite were the ones I call shark fins. And that's the rock that sticks up out of the dirt, like almost like a razor blade. And you have to walk on top of these. And the bulk of these rocks, they're probably 8 feet in diameter, but just the top, just this much pokes out. And you're just constantly rolling your ankles and tripping your... Oh. So the first time you see real mountains again is this. So it kind of gives you that, that second wind that you've been hoping for, you heard about the Virginia blues, and you get to the whites and it just starts taking miles away from you. You kind of hit this mental wall. Remember the Valley of Despair back at the beginning of the hike? You kind of get a second one of those here. I mean, look at some of this. The terrain is very different from what we see around here. You see this at the Parkway because they've blasted it, but this is the natural terrain up there. In the southern part of Maine, there's a stretch called Mahoosic Notch. And most of the guidebooks describe Mahoosic Notch as both the most challenging and most fun mile on the entire trail. And I have to agree. If you go back to this previous picture, so this is not Mahoosic Notch, but it's very similar to what the Notch is. So if you'll imagine a vertical cliff face like this, and maybe a quarter of a mile away from it running parallel is another vertical cliff face. And it's almost like this canyon that runs for a mile. And for 10 million years, chunks of it have been falling off and piling up in this gorge in the center. So what you get is this giant playground of boulders. And some of the rocks are the size of the chairs that we're sitting on. Some of the rocks are the size of this entire room. And they're just piled and they've fallen on each other and there's no order to it at all. And you can see in the picture here, like I'm squeezing between some things there and kind of making a face. But there really are places in Mahoosic Notch where the trail maintainers have painted with the same white they use for the blazes, arrows that point into this dark hole where you just take off your pack and push it through and wiggle. You just trust, okay, I'm really going there, and you see the light and you come out on the other side and you can hear water running somewhere down below, but you don't see it, and it's a little creepy, and some of the rocks wobble when you stand on them, and it's just, I thought it was a giant playground. It's like an obstacle course. I had so much fun. I took 3 hours to hike that mile of trail, just because it was a combination of kind of a butt kicker, but also fun. Guidebooks got that one right, I must say. So after, you're in southern Maine, which is very challenging. I said from the whites you can almost see the end. 100-mile wilderness. We talked about this before. We were talking about how the southbounders go and what a challenge this is. There's a sign at the beginning that's you often see it in like scary signs, websites, and forums. And the sign says basically like this is a very serious section of trail. You must be an experienced hiker. Plan for at least 10 days. There are no resupply points in the middle. And then right at the end it says, happy hiking. Like, you might die. Have fun. But it's true because the resupply points are just a little over 100 miles apart. There's one road that goes through the center of the 100-mile wilderness, and it is a private logging road which is gated and padlocked at both ends. So when you get to that road and stick out your thumb, nothing happens. So there really, there's... I would say check the guidebooks on this one because it changes from year to year. One hostel on either end usually works out some deal with the trucking company that owns that road to allow them access to come in, and if you'll give them, it was like $50 the year that I did it. They'll take a 5-gallon bucket of, like one of those food service buckets, and they'll put whatever you want in it, and either A, try to meet you and hand it off to you, or what's more likely, B, is they're going to throw a rope over a tree that they already have permission from the logging people, and that's your food bag, right? So I chose that option because by the time I got to this point, I did not want the hike to be over. You know, I still had this kind of ticking clock. I realized I was just barely going to make it before they closed the mountain, so I'm going to keep going. Part of that was the people. I didn't want to have to restart and meet a new group of friends. You form these relationships out on the trail that are almost, in fact, as strong as family, I believe. You become family with these people, and it's not just because of the shared misery, but it's the shared joy as well. And that and a combination of something called Katahdin fever. You know, like I want that big dramatic finish. I can't take my eyes off it. I just got to keep going. But I also didn't want it to end. So I did my best to make the 100-mile wilderness take as long as possible, and purely by accident, the people who I was hiking with got split up so that some of them were a few miles ahead of me, some of them were a few miles behind me, and for the entire 8 days that it took for me to get through this incredibly beautiful stretch of trail, I never saw hardly another soul. And it was just incredible to finally, be at the penultimate part of the hike and have this tremendous experience and feel like that I was really bonding with nature. And that's when the Giardia struck. That's when I realized that I'd made a mistake with my water filtration and that things were probably not quite as I'd hoped they'd be. What happened was, water filtration is very important. A lot of people will try to tell you that you can just drink the water on the AT, just scoop it. We call it the old dip and sip. Just take it right from the earth and drink it. And some people can do that. Some people can also drive without their seatbelts and are still alive for some reason. But I think of water filtration as a seatbelt. It's so easy to do. It doesn't take any time at all. And 100% of the time I've filtered my water, I've come home without Giardia. And it's so awesome to not have. I started my hike with a Sawyer squeeze, which is a very popular filtration system, and for good reason. The filter itself is fantastic. The thing that I don't like about them is the foil bags that they come with are notorious for puncturing or ripping. And my third and final backup had failed somewhere just prior to the 100-mile wilderness. Some kind southbounders gave me the last of their extra Aquamira. Aquamira is another great solution. It comes in 2 tiny little bottles, just the size of the second knuckle of your thumb up. Tiny little bottles. And you put a few drops of each into your water. You wait a few minutes, and it kills everything but you. It kills all of the bacteria or anything that would make you sick. That's actually my preferred method. These days, I might be switching back to some other squeeze filter, but I ran out of Aquamira just prior to the 100-mile wilderness. Remember earlier I alluded to the fact that the other resupply points are kind of weak? In Maine, Baxter State Park does not have running water or electricity. There are no billboards on any highway in Maine. It's a beautiful, wild place, and they plan on keeping it that way for a really long time. Which means that when you go into, you don't have outfitters, when you go into a store, you've got fish hooks and hand warmers. Aquamira might as well be some part for the space shuttle. Never heard of it. You're on your own. Good luck. So I figured I can almost see the end from here. I'm just going to drink that beautiful, crystal clear. You even see it in Ingalls in the bottled water section. Crystal clear Maine spring water. That stuff will kill you. That after picture where I look like the clown from It with rabies. That's what Giardia will do to you. What happens is it's a colony of bacteria that live in your intestines, and it will digest your food that you eat before you get a chance to. So it's taking all of the nutrition out of everything you eat. And as an added bonus, since a bacteria is a living organism, it produces waste. Its waste comes out where your waste was supposed to come out. It's just, please filter your water. It's terrible. Let's not finish with a horrifying poop story. So, I got to Katahdin. I saw the pictures from earlier. It was my birthday. It was the first week of October. It was October the We actually sat at the base of the mountain for a day because, what was it, like 17 degrees and almost no visibility. So we waited. I went up the morning of the 9th. Katie joined me. My hiking buddies, my trail family, we all left that morning. And when we were coming down, when we were coming up, there was a guy coming down who had this incredible white beard. And, I remember asking him, like, how's the weather up at the top? How's it going? And it wasn't until I got right up to him and started talking that I realized it was someone I knew who doesn't have a white beard. His beard was doing what these rocks were doing. He went up prior to sunrise and came back with, like, he had to crack his beard to get a drink of water because it was so cold up there. And the clouds were covering the top of the mountain. I didn't care. I just wanted to go up. And just before we got to the top, the clouds broke and the sun came out. And it was one of the most perfect. I couldn't have possibly, in all of my years of dreaming, in decades of imagining what this experience would be like, I never could have imagined what it was like to hike up that final mountain and touch that sign. It was like, they say at the end of your life, your whole life flashes before your eyes. When I got to that sign, my whole hike flashed before my eyes. And I could see every scrape and every mosquito bite and every drop of rain and it took slow motion. It's almost like I never touched this. I think I still haven't touched that sign, and that I'm imagining all of this right now. But I cried, and it was just such a beautiful, satisfying experience. And then it's over. That's it. Go home. We're done. Just like that. It feels that abrupt when it ends. Because remember, you got to ease into this new lifestyle, both physically and mentally. And after Katahdin, there's no more, you're out of trail. There's no more trail. So you go home and you start pacing the living room. You start finding every excuse you can to get outside and walk. You start sleeping on the porch again, just like you did when you were a little kid, before you even knew that people did things like this. It's actually pretty difficult coming back. And there's a very real thing called post-trail depression that doesn't really get talked about that much because, by its nature, you tend to keep that to yourself. And, it hit me really, really hard when I got back. So I would recommend that anyone who's planning on doing something like this, even if you're going out for a month, is have a little bit of wiggle room at the end to kind of, like an airlock. You need to decompress after an experience like this. It takes an awful lot of, you have to overcome tremendous mental challenges to stay on the trail. And then once you're done, in a way, you're kind of still on the trail. It changes your perspectives. It makes you think differently about not just what you can do, but what's really important. You spend, like I said, at one point, my idea of comfort was my raincoat as a blanket and my laundry as a pillow. My most prized possession was a cup. In a way, it's a very monk-like experience. You wander the earth with all your possessions on your back, and your only needs are food, water, and shelter. It takes people say the trail changes you. I like to think what it does is that it strips you of everything that wasn't already you to begin with, much in the same way that you shake down your pack and get rid of all that extra stuff that you don't need, right? The trail, it treats you the way a sculptor treats a block of marble. It takes away everything that's not you, and what's left is really, really solid. And that's what's at the heart of you and who you are. What do you really need? What does it take to make you happy? Do I really need a 2-door Lexus convertible? I just spent 6 months, with a cup. Yay! You know what I mean? Like, noodles, awesome! You get to that point where you're like, you start thinking about things like, okay, our drapes are fine. We don't need to replace them. You start really changing how you look at material things and what you want to do with your life. And if you're not careful, you might go a little crazy from an experience like this. I think it's kind of safe to say that may have happened to me. But considering that I was a little weird to begin with, I think that, maybe it wasn't that much of a change. One of the guys I used to work with at my software company said, Gary, the trail, all that time on the trail really changed you. And I swear I wasn't being glib. I wasn't trying to be cute. But I instantly replied, no, actually, it was all those years climbing the corporate ladder that changed me. Climbing mountains brought me back. So, that took a really long time for me to process and to figure out, that that's what actually happened out there. When I came back, I would do things like I couldn't share a bed with my wife anymore because it was weird to be, if a person was touching me, that meant that Lemmy's sleeping bag was too close and his arm was over my face. You know what I mean? It was weird having 4 walls in the space where I sleep. If it wasn't a tent, it was always a shelter with that missing wall. So you can watch the sun come up or the weather or hear the birds. And, when you turn to the side and see a glowing green LED with numbers on and floating by your face in the middle of it, that's not natural. It's a little off-putting. My alarm clock was made of birds for so long. Nobody wants that. It drives you a little crazy. I tried to go back to work. I really did. I made a serious, concerted effort to go back to the software world and incorporate what I learned out there, and how to I was motivated and I could tackle big projects. I understood logistics and long-term planning and budgeting. That's what I put on my second resume. After about a month, I started having panic attacks. I started questioning, why am I doing this? So I'd find myself sitting in gray windowless conference rooms with a tie wrapped around my neck while 2 people yelled about ones and zeros. And in my head, I was back out there with the birds and the sunshine and the wind on my face. And remember I said my wife was 90% behind me on the whole idea of the hike? She's super supportive. And my old work structure was I would travel 4 days for work. I'd fly to the client, I'd go do their thing, and I'd fly back home. So we already established a pattern of Gary's job takes him away for a few days, then he comes back. So what I did was I wound up, to deal with this, I took my notes. Every night on the trail, I had a little waterproof notebook that I would try to write at least 1 sentence, something to jog my memory. And after I quit my job the second time, I took that notebook out into the trails and parks around here where we live. We're surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of miles. Pisgah National Forest is 500,000 acres of woods. This is exactly what I needed. My new commute no longer involved the airport. It was me with my tent again. I took a little tiny Bluetooth keyboard out into the woods with me, and I processed my notes, and I talked to my therapist when I was in town. And it took me a while to figure out what happened out there. And when I was done, I had this stack of pages that turned into a manuscript. And I thought, okay, I know my mom will buy a copy. This is my business plan, right? I've got at least 6 friends who can read. I'm going to give this thing a shot. So, I hired an editor. I got some cover art, and I put this thing out there. And by the time about a month had gone by, it was the #1 hiking and camping book on Amazon, and it's been in the top 10 for almost the last 3 years, which means I haven't had to go back and do the whole ones and zeros thing for some time. I've been incredibly lucky to have this experience, and that experience and what I did with it has allowed me to share it with people even more. So this is now how I'm able to come to REI and talk to you about this sort of thing, how to plan. But I also go around, I go to schools and churches and Boy Scout troops, and I tell a different version of this story, one that's based on perseverance and accomplishing your goals. And it's allowed me to really explore a different side of myself that I never knew that I had in me before. It was always ones and zeros and deadlines, and I was really good at right angles and that sort of thing. It turns out I've got a little bit of a creative side to me too. And it was nature and the trail and the people and that whole experience that allowed me to kind of do what Benton Mackay and Myron Avery did, was take 2 sides that shouldn't go together and become something whole. At least that's how I feel about it. I'm super happy to stick around for as long as you guys want. It's 8 o'clock. I know the schedule said 8:30, but they usually schedule these to 8. Either way, I'm happy to stick around and hang out with you guys as much as you want. Like I said before, I've got hundreds of hours of stories. We're not going to do them all tonight, but I talked about this earlier today too. Stories from the Trail is a podcast that we started. I say we, the young lady with the degree in neuroscience and anthropology. Turns out she's really good at talking. So she and I were approached by a website called The Trek. Maybe you've heard of thetrek.co. It's one of the largest outdoor websites that relates to trail life and trail culture. Zach Davis is a friend, and he asked us to start a podcast. So we did about a year ago. And what we've begun doing recently, about 6 weeks ago, we've turned our format, rather than being an interview-style show, to one that's a weekly session that does basically what we're doing here tonight. So there's already, I think, like 4 or 5 of these weekly episodes out, and we'll spend an entire hour just talking about gear, or an entire hour just talking about food, or an entire hour just talking about here's how to plan your resupply drops, with question and answers in real time from the listeners, and usually a guest who knows more about this stuff than I do. I'm not an expert. I just know how to listen, right? I'm the one talking all night, listener, right? So Stories from the Trail is available wherever you get podcasts, Spotify, iTunes, anywhere you can find it, if you're interested in doing that. That's what we're recording tonight, by the way. So thank you all for being here. And if you want to stick around, as I said, I'll be happy to answer your questions. We've also got some books, which I'll be happy to sign and personalize for you as well. Are we ready to... Or do we want to do Q&A or individual? I don't know. If anybody, how about this? If anybody needs to leave because it's a school night, thank you so much. We'll stick around and do more questions. Yes?
So you said with some people you were traveling together, like almost like family.
Mm-hmm.
How many people were you together in these family-style travels?
Okay, so the question, I'm just going to repeat for the mic. The question was about trail families and about how many people are in them. And this is something I really, really like to talk about because I was surprised by the trail family structure and how that all plays into trail life. So the picture that I've got over here is myself with my 2 trail partners, Voldemort and Lemmy. Voldemort, her trail name came about because we couldn't get any other trail names to stick. We tried naming her. You don't have to accept your trail name, and you're allowed to come up with one on your own. All these rules you've heard about are all made up, so you can kind of do whatever you want. But we tried to give Megan several different trail names, and she rejected so many of them that Katie actually came up with the idea of calling her She Who Shall Not Be Named, Voldemort, right? If you're a Harry Potter fan, you know what that means. Our other friend, Lemmy, this is the guy who was from Israel, the guy who drew all these cartoons. It was interesting. Megan and I met pretty early on the trail and started hiking together almost immediately. Lemmy was a few days ahead of us, but we knew he was out there because instead of writing in the logbooks in the shelters, he was drawing pictures to document his hike. But his pictures were things that he wished would happen rather than things that actually happened. For example, a bear mauling some annoying hiker. It was like this big, cute, fluffy, like almost a teddy bear, but it had fangs and like bloody hiker gore all around it. His style was really interesting, captivated me immediately, and I said, I've got to get to know this guy. So Megan and I were kind of on this quest to like meet Lemmy. And then when we caught up with him, we became like the 3 Musketeers. We were just inseparable for so long. And that's kind of what happens out there. People will start solo or on their own and immediately find somebody who like, oh, these are my people. And you become almost cliquish. Some of these groups, I guess like for some of the younger hikers, like the kids right out of college or, like they'll form these little groups and like, we're the cool kids and you're not. But for the most part, it's actually this extended family, right? It's not just the 3 of us hiking together. The bubble is hundreds of hikers long and hundreds of miles long. And think about when you're in stop-and-go traffic and you've got 5 lanes of cars. They're all going the same direction, but at 1 mile per hour. And you kind of change lanes, and for a while, I'm going to hang out with a red Volkswagen for a while. And oh, hey, there's that Subaru. I haven't seen him in a few hours, like if traffic's really bad. Same thing happens with hikers on the trail. You kind of get to know each other as, like, okay, I know who's behind me and I know who's ahead of me. You really know who's ahead of you because they're writing in the books. The people behind you, they're passing messages via the faster hikers. And you get this thing that's called the hiker grapevine, which I guess is how people communicated before we had cell phones. They all talked to each other and wrote messages. You kind of get back down to that primitive level of, being friends on the trail. And this big extended family becomes so close that even if you lose your two buddies for like a week, it's no big deal. Because this trail goes on forever. You have infinity to find your friends again. So you don't really worry about like, oh, Lemmy, how's it been? I haven't seen you for 100 miles. You know, that's just like a natural part of trail life. People just kind of come and go. Yeah, it's really it's really an incredible experience. The people, not just on the trail, but the people who live and work around the trail are also super special too. One story that I love to tell is about how I met Lode on the trail. This guy whose trail name was Lode. He was a local in Pennsylvania, still is, and as I think so. And I met Lode at one of the first shelters in Pennsylvania. And again, this is another purely by coincidence. I wound up separated from my friends. Some were ahead, some were behind. So I had the entire shelter to myself. In fact, I had both shelters to myself because this was one of those rare, beautiful PA shelters that comes in pairs. There's a sign on one that says snoring and another one that says no snoring. I had my choice. Sitting between the shelters, and I was eating my dinner, and there was this guy. I could see, it was dusk, and I could see somebody walking up towards me. All I could see was a headlamp, and the headlamp was really high up, so I knew somebody big was coming my way. And, you know, just like a snake, I could feel him coming. This guy was maybe 300 pounds. And as he approached me, he said, "Hey, we got any hikers in the shelter?" Big, loud guy. "Just me." And he came and sat down beside me at the picnic table. And it turns out what this Lode character does, I guess he's semi-retired, and he's got a place that's about a mile, or not even a mile, it's like a few hundred feet off the trail in Pennsylvania. And what Lode likes to do is he'll fill up his backpack with those ice packs that you put in your cooler and take cold drinks and popsicles and like things you would never expect to see on the trail, and like passes them out to hikers. You know, it turns out it was just me that day, so we had a real sugary feast. And while we were hanging out, Lode said, "I like you." Here, he gives me his phone number and said, if anything happens to you while you're in Pennsylvania, no matter where you are, give me a call. I'll hook you up. I'll take care of you. Yeah, that's cool, man. That's great. If you get to New Jersey, tear my number up. I'm not going into New Jersey. As long as you're in PA, I got your back. So I was like, all right, cool. We hung out for a little while. I kept his number, and I didn't really think about it that much. In fact, I think I might have even, put it with things I had planned to throw away at the next stop or whatever. But about that time, I started feeling a little run down. Started to get shivers one day, my goosebumps on my arms. Started feeling really tired and lethargic. After a couple of days of this, I noticed that I was falling asleep in the middle of the day. Like I would stop at a water stop, and I would drink some water, and just kind of close my eyes for a minute, and open my eyes, and 4 hours had gone by. It's not normal to black out for 4 hours in the middle of the day on a thru hike. So, I began wondering, okay, I got to the point where I didn't know what was happening to me, and I said, I know I need to get to a doctor. I'm kind of screwed. I'm over a barrel here. I'll call Lode. So I dialed him up, and he was like, "Sure, buddy, just tell me where you are. Nearest road crossing, I'll come get you." And he hiked in and took my pack and helped carry it to the car, and he took me to his house and put me in a trailer in his front yard, like a big, like tow behind your truck trailer. I had my own bedroom, my own bathroom. I had air conditioning. The Wi-Fi reached out there. His wife fed me. They took me to the doctor. That's how I found out I had Lyme disease, by the way. Quick side note on that. Despite checking for ticks every single day, I still got Lyme disease. The year that I hiked, of the people who finished, I'd say close to 1 in 4 of us got Lyme disease. I've always been really, really afraid of Lyme disease, like paranoid and like picking for ticks. And turns out one of the best ways to conquer your fears is to have that fear come true and then find out that it's really not that bad as long as you're smart about it. We caught my Lyme disease within a week. Lode took me to the doctor. They put me on a round of antibiotics called doxycycline. And within 3 days, I was completely back to normal. You keep taking it for the full cycle, right? Even after you feel fine, because you're supposed to. But, I really dodged a bullet on that one. If you get Lyme disease and don't treat it for 6 months or more, it'll stay with you for a really long time. But Lode helped me out, and that's just the kind of person that lives near the trail. You hear about trail angels. Lode was a trail angel, although he disliked the term. He said, "I'm not an angel, I'm a magician." So he performed trail magic. In fact, after Katie came to meet me at Katahdin while we were driving back to North Carolina, went south towards North Carolina, Lode's house was one of the places that we stopped along the way. So you don't just form lifelong friendships with the people you hike with, but also with the trail community itself, or people from previous years, or next year's hikers, or people you meet at an REI class. We're all part of this together. Anything else? Yes, sir.
When you so is it true that you have to stay in a shelter if you're on the Appalachian Trail, or can you camp near a shelter in a tent by yourself?
Question was, are you required to stay at the shelters? Only in the Smokies do they require you to stay at the shelters. And if the shelter is full, you're allowed to pitch your tent at the shelter. But the Smokies and the Whites as well. There are parts of the Whites where you're not allowed to do what they call stealth camp. Stealth camp means just putting your tent wherever you get tired at the end of the day. So the Smokies is the only place that has that restriction other than the Whites. Yes, sir.
If we were to spend a couple of nights on the AT, where would you recommend?
If you were to spend a couple nights on the AT, where would I recommend? So I would say try to get to depending on what your hiking experience is, I would say a good introduction to the AT would be a springtime midweek hike at Roan Highlands. I say midweek because you're going to miss the crowds, right? On the weekends, it can be a real zoo up there. And I say mid-spring because if you can time it so that the rhododendrons are blooming, it's just truly a magical experience. You're going to get some really nice 360-degree views on some gentle terrain. And if you feel like going all the way to the Over Mountain Shelter, that is a giant 2-story barn that just has a spectacular view right out the front door, some excellent camping spots, abundant water, pretty forgiving terrain. I'd say that's a good place to start. If you're looking for a challenge, I would say go over to Franklin area and tackle some of the parts of the Nantahala Gorge. Hike up either to the fire tower or Jacob's Ladder and see how you feel about 3 hours of continuous uphill. See how that. I'd say maybe that's not. Depends if you want to have fun, go to Roan Highlands. If you want to challenge yourself and really train, NOC is a good place to see how your trail legs are coming. I saw a hand up in the back. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Is there an etiquette about greeting each other on the trail? Or not greeting?
An etiquette about greeting each other on the trail. Greeting.
I used to take out groups of hikers into the Carpathian Mountains.
Okay.
And we met 100 people. We greet 100 people and they greet us there.
Oh, like each individual.
Yeah, somebody's coming, you meet, you say, hi, how are you? Hi, how are you? But here, I greet people, and about 6 out of 10 don't greet me. So I stopped greeting people. If I see a hand raising, then I greet. Yeah,
I would stop and talk, and we'd waste 2 hours at the spring together. I say hi to everybody, almost everybody. I never pass anybody on the trail. The only people, I'm a slow hiker. The only people I pass who pass me are the ones going the opposite direction.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, but I guess that's just really an individual thing. If there's a large group of people, like a hiking club, they're usually trying to get somewhere, and they're focused. And I don't know, that's weird. I never really thought about that before. I think it's there's no rule.
In the guides back home, it says that when you meet somebody, make sure to greet them.
I think
that was one of the things of the rules of the trail was one of the things.
I think we should start doing that. I think it's a great idea.
And here, I can walk for 2 hours and I don't see anybody, and somebody comes and I greet them and they just.
It's unfortunate. I'll say hi to you. Yes, ma'am.
In one of your early slides, it said, where did the pecs come from?
Oh, right. Yeah, so the pecs come from all of that upper body in the northern part of the trail, like using your hands to scale up those rock faces and climbing ladders and rebar and catching yourself when you fall. And you really start to get that back during the last probably 300 miles of the trail. So you've got about 3 weeks of doing a little bit of something. All right. Any other questions?
congratulations on your Amazon.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I also recorded an audio book, too, if anybody's interested in having the book read to them. And if you don't have an Audible account, I offer a premium service where I call you on your phone each night and read you a chapter just before bed. Not really. Okay, well, thanks again, everybody. You guys are awesome, and we're going to do this right here. So, thank you. That's cheap. I should stop doing that. But seriously, thank you very much. Thank you. It's just backwards. Oh, man, you're right.
It's right here.
Oh, thanks. So, let's see, how about you and I trade places?
Okay.
And then you can for books. Yeah, oh, that's right. So I have two different books. So this is my book about the AT. And then this is the second book that I wrote after this. But Home is Forward goes back in time to the years before I hiked the AT. And it has some world travel in there. Iceland, Peru, Newfoundland, a couple of other places. So this one's more short stories. This is the AT. How's it going? Great. And what's your name? Is it Greg or Greg? With a G. And do you have the? Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Oh, you did. Oh, okay.
Awesome.
Well, then.
Super cool.
Okay.
That's great.
Yeah, they sell it at the store too, but they actually just ran out. So.
Yeah.
How fun! It's like full draw, self-portrait. It's weird. Oh, thanks so much for coming out.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
What do you think?
Hello.
Hi.
Okay. That is 15. We do cash or cards. What's your name?
Debbie.
Debbie.
Thank you.
Thank you. I did too.
Good. Yeah, we can tell you did. Yes. Thank you.
Great. How are you? Oh, one of each. All right. So we got. It's a 20.
I just forget.
It's 2 for 25.
Is that right? That doesn't sound right.
That's right. Yeah. 15, 12, and 2 for 25 or something like that.
Oh, it is 25. You're right.
What's your name?
Tim.
Tim?
You say take a card?
Yep. Turn on. Yes. One of each.
So, you thought about maybe doing it again?
Yes. Yeah. No concrete plans yet, but and I already know what I'm going to do differently. And yeah.
I thought it was interesting. You said just 3 weeks. I'm gonna do it.
No, you wonder about people that have. I'm gonna hike in 2021. Wow, that's really far
How
away.
can you wait?
That is so far away. Go now.
But it is true. You always it's like, oh man, as soon as I get this done,
It's always a thing.
It's not a good
It's always a thing in
time.
the way. Yes.
it's always.
Thanks for coming out, Tim. Nice to meet you. How's
I
it
just
going?
want to say thank you.
Oh,
That's awesome.
my pleasure. Yeah.
Also, go to Grayson Highlands.
Oh yeah, that's right.
In Virginia.
Yeah.
That's like tied with Roan Mountain.
Yeah, we had Rhode Highlands in mind. Yeah, so that was
Yeah.
kind of a thought.
Yeah.
We haven't been.
That
Oh,
picture at the
really
very
cool.
beginning, the one that I had before I started with just like the mountain.
Mhm.
That's Rhode Highlands. It's
Cool.
just big, giant, grassy fields. It's so nice.
And don't miss it, because Grayson Islands is near Damascus, and Damascus is an awesome town where you can walk down Main Street and you're on the AT.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a cool area, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And there's ponies.
And they're tame.
My uncle and his 2 children do like a 2-night overnight each summer.
Nice.
So we're gonna join them this year. But
Heck yes.
we have the PCT in our sights for next year.
Okay.
So-
There you go.
That's great.
Yeah.
So now we're just trying to soak it all up all on the East Coast.
Yeah, enjoy the water here because there won't be much out there.
And we listen to Trey.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Zach's podcast.
I was
Backpacker
listening to
Radio.
it this morning and I heard of you like mention,
Ah.
but I didn't know.
Oh, did he
No,
finally?
that's
Is he
crazy.
and we're,
Yeah.
Supposedly we're a network.
Come on, Zach.
You're gonna talk about my show.
That's funny.
Props all the time. That's 15. 15.
15?
Yep.
Okay.
Thank
I
you
like
very
one.
much.
Thank you guys. Have
Consider
fun.
yours. Thanks again.
Oh, I gotta get box.
If you guys want to grab one of these cards, my email's on there. I'd just love to hear about how your hike goes when you hit the PCT.
Or even just road. How awesome
You know, if
that
you have
is.
Instagram or something, just tell me to follow you guys out. I don't know.
Cool.
Thank
Thank
you.
Thank
Stuff.
you.
Have a good night.
Yep,
Thanks
you
a lot.
guys do.
What's your name?
Victor, I appreciate your presentation. You can tell you're having fun with it.
That's my favorite thing to do.
You live local, y'all?
In Campbell.
In Camden,
Mhm.
yeah.
10 minutes from Mount Pisgah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, I live at Lake Gillespie.
Oh, nice.
Hey.
I belong to a Thursday hikers group, leisure hikers.
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of women in it, and if it rains, we don't hike.
Sometimes there's been many hikes where we say, you know, we could have a beer and a cheeseburger in less than an hour.
yeah.
Let's just
Good,
go.
good training hike. Good
Yep,
training.
yep.
My birthday's in June, and my favorite place to go is to the Roan Highlands
Yeah.
with the rhododendron in bloom,
Oh,
and enjoy that. We went up there in the rain, and
yeah.
it
It doesn't
was
matter.
great too. Yeah, it's a great place. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
Thanks a
Well
lot.
done.
Thank you.
Have a good night.